This summer, Londoners realised what it meant to have motorways through their city. The opening of Westway focused attention on the plight of those forced to live in its shadow. With 50 miles of motorway planned for London in the next 30 years, many felt that they could be next. The GLC has now agreed to rehouse the residents of Acklam and Acklam Road.
Nearly 9 years, and we could put up with what we had to put up with the garage and that.
And
It was just bringing dirt in there.
I was born in my sitting room, and believe me, it's living hell to be here now. 7 o'clock I went to sleep this morning, and I got out when the boys knocked me up at 9 o'clock this morning. And I've got 2 suffering with heart complaints, living at the top of the house.
I can't put that baby out to the door to sleep in a pram. She suffocates with the fumes. You take her in and shut the window, she suffocates from the damp. What do you do about it?
Housing, they could well be left for 10 or 20 years, and that's 3 generations. And I think the people in Acklam Road are saying that the next generation is not going to suffer, and they're prepared to fight all out to make sure that something is done now.
Westway was first thought of in the 1930s. The present road was on the drawing board 9 years ago. Construction started in 1966. Since then, the local residents have had to put up with pile drivers and bulldozers. John Yearwood invested his life savings in a grocery store. The motorway forced him to close it 3 years ago when construction work cut off his customers.
It's all closed, blocked up. They paled it off with galvanized sheets, and nobody can get in. And I wasn't getting sales enough. I was compelled to close it down because I have to pay for goods that I get. I buy.
Have you got any compensation?
Nothing at all. No compensation. Nothing at all. Even even my house was smashed by the hydraulic pounding and the throwing down of the buildings opposite. And I wrote the company, the GLC, asking them to give me some cement and sand and some paint to help me do the house, and they haven't answered me up to now. They ignored it.
So what have you done to the house? Have you done your own repairs?
Yes, I've done my own repairs. It has costed me a lot of money in buying materials and paper and all kinds of things. Then my own labour. Nobody would pay me for my own labour, you see. It's about, I'm sure it could be between £2,500 it cost me to put it back in condition.
By law, the GLC had to compensate those who had their homes in the path of the motorway, but they were under no obligation to rehouse those living nearby. As yet, there are no standards laid down to decide when rehousing or compensation is necessary, either by the Ministry of Transport or the GLC.
There are, of course, degrees necessarily of noise and visual intrusion being suffered. We're dealing with the worst. Those which are much more seriously affected, then houses would be alongside an ordinary high-speed road. If you spent a night in many desirable residences alongside the North Circular, or alongside Kingston Bypass, or 101 roads up and down the country, in London or in villages outside London on main trunk roads, you'd have a sleepless night unless you were used to it. I'm afraid this is just one of those things in modern life.
Being one of those fortunate enough not to live by a trunk road or motorway, I spent 3 nights sleeping out by 3 of London's motorways to see if it was as bad as people were making out. I spent my first night under Westway. I went to bed about midnight and tried with little success to get to sleep. I must have dropped off about 1:30, exhausted. I slept quite well until the lorry driver's rush hour at 5:30, and it's not just the noise, it's like trying to sleep in broad daylight. But the night I spent at Hendon was worse. There, the M1 extension ran 11 feet from my bedroom window. It was far too close for comfort, let alone sleep. Mr. Ezekiel bought his flat in 1962 for £3,000. When the plans for the M1 extension were announced in 1965, he fought them, and he's still fighting. I asked him how much his flat had lost in value since he bought it.
£2,000. But may I say this, that if I was to buy another flat at the moment, or a property at the moment, it will cost us not less than £7,000 to £8,000, because the property has risen from 1962 and you are now in 1970, a considerable amount. Apart from the property rising, you have to pay increased rates, interest rates, which is over 2% the time when I bought it. And there's the conveyancing fees, the solicitor's fees, other expenses. I mean, who is going to bear all that?
For 5 years, Mr. Ezekiel has written to and seen just about every official, council and ministry possible, but he's got nowhere, and it's going to get worse when they open the other extension in 18 months' time. Many of the residents of Gilder Court are trying to sell up and get out, but, surprise, surprise, there are few who want to buy. Mr. and Mrs. Davis bought their flat in 1965. They thought it would be a lovely place to retire to with its grass, trees and flowers. Did you know about the motorway when you bought your flat?
Well, my solicitor said that there's going to be a motorway or flyover or something, but it will take about 2 to 5 years before they start.
And how long ago was this when he told you this?
Just over
Well,
2
we
years.
moved
2 years ago.
We moved here on the 19th of June, and they started the beginning of July.
Mr. Davis, what's the thing that you miss most now that there's a motorway? What's it deprived you of in particular?
Well, it deprives me really of my sunlight, doesn't it?
Does that mean then that you've got to keep the lights burning and the fire burning in winter?
Well, from next month on, I'll have to have the fire all day and the light all day, which we can ill afford, really, on our pension.
This is the M4 at Chiswick, London's first and now London's busiest motorway. Down here is the Great West Road. Over there is Adelaide Terrace. The current market value of those houses should be about £5,000. But if you wanted to sell one today, then you'd be very lucky to get £3,000 for it. Mr. and Mrs. McSherry bought their house 10 years ago. The Great West Road was there already, but much further away and separated from their front window by trees and a grass verge. They'd heard that there was going to be a motorway, but had been told it would go behind the house. They were horrified when they saw the M4 being built outside their front door. It's made the front room virtually unusable. What happens normally when you want to let someone into the room? Do you have to open the windows and put up with the noise?
Yes, we do, but normally we don't open them. Not if we're going to stay in here. We always keep them shut. Also in the bedroom upstairs, you couldn't possibly open a window and sleep.
Mrs. McSherry heard from school that her children were tired and inattentive, so she moved their bedroom to the back of the house. Mr. McSherry studied for a university degree.
I found it rather difficult to concentrate sometimes, but I managed to do it because you can, if you don't have to talk to anybody, it's easier. If people don't have to talk to you, you don't have to receive verbal instruction or anything like that. You don't. You get to be that you can cope with it. I mean, you can stand and read books on the street. Well, it's the same thing. I was reading books on the street practically while I was reading them in my front room.
You learned to live with it and accept it?
I haven't learned to accept it, no. And I'm not prepared to accept it because when you buy a house, you buy it for life. It's something, and you wouldn't normally choose to live in a place like this.
I spent the last of my 3 nights in Chiswick, and it was by far the worst. I hardly slept at all. The traffic wasn't spasmodic like it was at Westway and Hendon, but it kept up all night, lorry after lorry. The GLC are aware of the problems and are currently studying the effects of motorway noise on some of their estates and devising ways of minimising its effect.
Certain things can be measured quite accurately, like daylighting infringements. Noise is less exact, but we can make fairly accurate predictions on noise, and in fact did so on Westway. The measurements that have been taken subsequently on Westway accord very largely with the predictions that we made several years ago on what the likely noise levels would be. We hope by doing before and after tests on given situations, and also by carrying out physical improvements, not only to the properties themselves in the form of remedial treatment like double glazing and general improvements inside the dwellings, but by improving the surrounding environment and putting in other facilities, compensating facilities, that we shall be able to advise the committee much more carefully on whether properties ought to stay or whether they can continue to exist in proximity to a new road.
The noise levels of Westway are exactly as predicted 9 years ago. The story of Westway marks an important development in the relationship between the planners and the people who often suffer the effects of their planning. Although the GLC maintained that they'd always intended to rehouse Acklam Road, the tenants see the GLC's decision as a direct result of their militancy. And to many, Westway is a victory for the militants over the more conventional protesters. George Clark, who's been trying to organise a community now for 4 years, has strong views on those responsible for the planning of Westway.
I think the problem with the planning of the urban highways and the new sort of modern technology in cities is that the options which ought to be explored are not explored because they won't spend the money on the research. They prefer to fiddle around by taking noise tests 5 years, 6 years beforehand. By the time they got into that kind of research, the options open to them of putting the motorway underneath the roadway or maybe on ground level are lost sight of. The committee is so absorbed and fascinated by fiddling problems which don't relate to the more fundamental aspects of what they're doing that they never reach it.